Welcome back to the deep dive. Okay, you've sent us a really interesting stack of source material this time, digging into the early days of electroharmonics, specifically their gain pedals. And we're not just hitting the big names today. No, we're going deep on one that often gets, well, completely forgotten. We're talking about the pedal EHX, literally just called the Electroharmonics Overdrive. It's kind of the unsung middle child of their 1970s lineup, Not the Big Muff, definitely not the Hot Tubes.
That's spot on. I mean, everyone knows the Big Muff. It's iconic, right?
Yeah.
But EHX back then, their whole approach was, well, it was about variety. So our mission today is really to figure out what this overdrive pedal is all about. Where did it fit? Why did they even make it? And why do some people now call it this kind of underrated hidden gem?
Okay, yeah, let's unpack that. So timeline-wise, we're talking mid-70s?
Yeah, firmly mid-1970s. It popped up around the same time they released the floor box version of the Muff Fuzz.
Right, and the market for distortion, fuzz, overdrive, it was really heating up then, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely exploding. At EHX, well, they saw an opportunity. The Big Muff Pi was huge, literally and figuratively, but it was a very specific high-gain fuzz sound. They realized, I think, that not everyone wanted that much gain, that much compression. Some players just wanted something simpler, maybe more affordable, something that didn't completely change their amp sound.
So like a basic crunch.
Exactly. Something more like a tube amp pushed hard rather than, full-on fuzz assault. The overdrive was designed to be that pedal, the sort of the anti-muff almost.
It still seems kind of counterintuitive, though. If the Big Muff is selling like crazy, why divert resources to make this middle pedal? Wouldn't that just confuse people?
Well, that's the fascinating thing about EHX's strategy back then. The source is often called the kitchen sink catalog approach.
Ah.
Okay. They basically threw everything at the wall. EHX was a volume business, pure and simple. They weren't trying to find the perfect sound. They wanted a sound for every possible guitarist.
So cover all the bases.
Precisely. If you wanted boost, fuzz, overdrive, whatever. EHX aimed to have the cheapest, simplest option waiting for you. It was about market saturation. And maybe a bit of risk management too, right? If fuzz suddenly went out of style, they wouldn't be stuck. They'd have other options ready to go.
Okay, that makes sense. So if we lay out their gain options from that era, you had the LPB1 at the clean end, right? Just a simple boost.
Yep, clean boost.
Then the Muff Fuzz for, well, fuzz, but maybe a bit simpler, fuzzier.
Yeah, a bit more vintagey, less sustain than the Big Muff Pi.
And then smack in the middle, you slot in this pedal, the overdrive, for that medium gain, crunchy thing.
Exactly. And then they were already thinking ahead to the Hot Tubes, which was meant to be smoother, more like a real tube overdrive.
So they really did blanket the whole spectrum. Wow.
They did. The overdrive was aimed squarely at those players, maybe blues rock, classic rock, even early punk, who needed some grit and punch but didn't want the Big Muff's density, or its famous scoop.
Right, the scoop. We'll get to that. But this strategy, this mapping, it shows they were thinking really hard about covering the market, even if the pedal itself didn't become a legend.
Absolutely. It's a key part of the EHX story, more so maybe than the pedal's actual sales numbers.
Okay, so that's the why. Let's get into the what. What did this thing actually look like? What was inside the box?
Well, like its purpose, the design was all about simplicity and cost-effectiveness. It was a really straightforward two-transistor silicon overdrive circuit.
Two transistors. Silicon? Okay.
Yeah, ran on a standard 9-volt battery, nothing fancy there. And it came in that small, that wedge-style floor box, same one they used for the LPB1 boost. Very utilitarian.
Right, the little wedge.
Yeah.
So pretty basic components. For someone listening who isn't deep into circuits, what does that simple two-transistor design actually do to the sound? Why does it end up crunchy and grainy?
It's about how the signal clips. It's a roar kind of clipping compared to something like the Big Muff. The Muff uses multiple stages, diodes. It smooths things out, compresses the signal heavily, you get that huge sustain. The overdrive, with just those two transistors hitting their limit, clips more suddenly, more jaggedly. It's not super smooth like a modern op-amp overdrive, but it's also not the thick fuzz of the Muff.
So it sounds more like an old amp overloading?
Kind of, yeah. Like a slightly pushed solid-state circuit from that era, maybe.
Yeah.
It gives it that characteristic raw, kind of gritty 70s texture.
And the controls were simple too, right? Just volume and then something like boost or drive.
That's it. Volume, sometimes labeled level, and then boost or drive for the amount of gain. Super simple interface.
But even with that simplicity, the sources say there was a specific choice made about the voicing, that it was deliberately made warmer sounding than the Muff Fuzz.
Yeah, they definitely tweaked this circuit for a bit more warmth. trying to hint at that tube amp feel, maybe, rather than just harsh transistor distortion. But the really cool part is how it changes as you turn up the gain.
How so?
Well, at lower settings, it really acts more like a dirty boost. It doesn't totally change your tone, just add some volume, some thickness, pushes your amp a bit harder, adds just a little hair.
Okay, like adding a bit of grit.
Exactly. But then, as you crank that boost knob up, past noon maybe, that 2-transistor clipping really kicks in. And that's where you get the proper crunchy, grainy distortion. Good for rhythm, clear enough for leads. It wasn't designed to get muddy.
Okay, now here's the part I find really interesting, especially thinking about EHX's biggest hit, the Big Muff. It's legendary for that massive mid-range scoop, right?
The classic smiley face EQ curve. Sounds huge on its own.
But famously vanishes as soon as the band starts playing.
Exactly. It gets buried into the bass and drums. It's a common complaint, even though people love the sound itself.
So what did the Overdrive do differently? This seems crucial.
This is the key. The Overdrive circuit was specifically voiced to have mid-range presence. They deliberately kept those middle frequencies in there.
Ah, so it would actually cut through the mix.
Precisely. That's why it still has fans today. If you were playing rhythm or needed leads that didn't disappear in a live band situation back in the 70s, the Overdrive was actually, a more practical choice than the Big Muff in some ways. Less epic, maybe, but more functional.
That shows real thoughtfulness, doesn't it? They knew the Big Muff's weakness and built an alternative right next to it.
It really does. It shows they were listening to what working musicians actually needed on stage, not just chasing the biggest, wildest sound. That mid-range focus is a really important technical detail.
Okay, so it's practical, functional, designed to cut through a real workhorse pedal. But let's face it never got famous. It was totally overshadowed by the Muffs and later the Hot Tubes. Why didn't it take off?
Yeah, it had a pretty short production run. Just a few years in the mid to late 70s. Its lack of fame probably comes down to a few things. A lot of it might be aesthetic, surprisingly.
The box.
Yeah, the little wedge box. Compared to the Big Muff's giant, imposing, almost military-grade enclosure, the Overdrive just looked kind of cheap and basic.
Less impressive on the pedal board.
Right. It didn't look substantial. And decades later, collectors often go for the things that look impressive, maybe seem more complex. The Overdrive was simple visually, and its circuit was simple electronically. So easy to just skip over. It didn't scream vintage collectible.
Which is exactly why it's become this hidden gem now, isn't it? People scroll past it online looking for muffs and miss this thing. So what are players who do find it appreciating today?
It's that unique character we talked about, that raw, almost amp-like grit. It gives you a real 70s texture, but without the heavy compression and without that famous muff scoop.
So it lets your guitar and amp sound more like themselves, just grittier.
Exactly. It feels more like an extension of your amp, adding crunch, rather than a totally separate fuzz layer sitting on top. For players chasing that authentic, slightly wild, period-correct crunch, it delivers something really specific that's hard to find elsewhere. It's got that untamed quality.
And even though EHX hasn't reissued it under that exact name, that simple circuit design didn't just vanish, did it?
Oh, definitely not. That core idea, a simple, effective 2-transistor stage for creating usable overdrive, you can see altos of that in later EHX designs. Some of the simpler, maybe Leap Muff variants, or other basic transistor overdrives they put out over the years.
So its DNA lived on.
Yeah, the specific pedal might have faded, but the lesson learned about making cost-effective, raw-sounding gain circuits, that definitely stuck around in the company's toolbox. So when you pull back and look at the whole picture, the EHX Overdrive is really this perfect little case study, isn't it? It shows EHX deliberately filling a specific need. Amp-like crunch, no heavy fuzz, no scoop. It highlights just how broad their strategy was back then. They really were trying to sell something to everyone.
Yeah, this deep dive really underlines that point. It wasn't about every pedal being a massive hit like the Big Muff. This overdrive was maybe strategically more important than it was commercially. It was built to be the perfect middle ground, and in that sense, maybe it succeeded perfectly.
Which brings us to a final thought, something for you, the listener, to chew on.
Yeah.
We've talked about how the overdrive offers this raw, amp-like grit from a really simple circuit, right? But collectors often overlook it because it's simple. So what does that tell us about how we value pedals? How much does the perceived complexity or maybe the visual impressiveness of a pedal influence its reputation and its value compared to just how it actually sounds and functions in a rig? Is simple sometimes overlooked just for being simple? Something to think about.